we've got this Russian submarine base, 70 odd miles away, which is, is no distance at all. So the Russians have been pretty tight-lipped about this. We know that many of their nuclear-powered submarines, but also their ballistic missile submarines that hold their nuclear deterrent, are based at this place. And the fact that we're hearing absolutely nothing about it and so tight-lipped, it does give one's concern that there may be some damage to this port and potentially to those submarines that are housed there. I would say that there at the moment there seems to be no indication of contamination from, say, one of these submarines sinking or being severely damaged. And one of the positives with radiation, it's relatively easy to detect, even with remote sensors. So the silence, I think, is deafening, as it were, that's coming out of the Kremlin at the moment about the state of those submarines and that secret base very near to this earthquake. Well, we've heard a very glib statement out of the Kremlin saying there are no casualties. However, on social media in the local area, there have been pictures of devastation and flooding and huge amounts of damage, and also local politicians being sort of slightly more vocal. But that is damage above the surface, as it were. We know with these sort of earthquakes that the damage below the surface can be far more devastating than what we see above it. So yeah, the official line is crack on, business as usual. But that sort of gives concern, because the whole world is looking at this earthquake. The whole world's looking at the damage that it's causing, thousands and thousands of miles away. So some secret base, within a stone's throw, and no comment from the Russian authorities. They haven't said it's fine, everything's great, there's no damage. Just a very glib statement, say there've been no casualties, which we know is a lie anyway, because there have been casualties. And we know that the Russians, their disinformation and propaganda and their manipulation of the truth, that's just what they do. So almost if they say there's nothing, we've got used to assuming that there probably is something that needs investigation. Well, certainly that is the Russian modus operandi. That is the way that the Kremlin works. That is in their psyche. Deny everything. And even if something is blatantly happening, I think their view is, if you deny it enough, eventually you start putting doubt in people's minds, and they start believing it. I mean, we just see from the massive disinformation and propaganda we see over Ukraine, quite what they're up against. I think we have to be very, very circumspect. And I think that's why we're discussing this. That is why the world is concerned, because we know the Russians are involved. And if there has been a disaster, they will try and cover it up. Now, I'm not anticipating anything like Chernobyl or Fukushima, those other nuclear accidents, but we do know that there are a lot of nuclear-powered submarines in that area, and presumably there are also a number of nuclear ballistic missiles on some of those submarines. So, of course, with those sort of weaponry and that amount of nuclear capability around, one is to be concerned. And if the Russians were really honest, they would come straight out. And let's just the final bit on this. One looks back to the Kursk submarine accident, which happened a few years. Kursk was the biggest submarine the Russians had ever built, and it sank in the Baltic Sea. And eventually it went down with a full crew of, I think, 150 or so. But actually, Britain had the rescue submarines in the area that could have gone and saved that submarine. But the Russians and Putin didn't want to admit to the world that their great submarine had sunk and broke up, and they were prepared to sacrifice the lives of all those people. So I think against that backdrop, that's why we are being, perhaps overly cynical about it, because we know what the Russians are capable of. Well, the SSBMs are the ones that carry their sort of equivalent of Trident nuclear missiles that we have on our Vanguard class submarines. So that is part of their nuclear deterrent. We know that the Russians have close to 5,000 nuclear warheads, about the same as the Americans. In contrast, Britain has about 200. The Russian nuclear deterrent is based in submarines, these ballistic missiles, but they also have tactical nuclear weapons that are fired from Iskander rocket launchers and also fired from Russian jets. Of course, the well-publicized Spider's Web operation by the Ukraine Secret Service a couple of months ago destroyed over a third of Russia's nuclear-capable aircraft, which was a severe blow to them. So the Russians, no doubt, will be far more reliant than they ever were on these SSBNs. We also understand there are attack submarines, conventional or submarines with conventional munitions, but nuclear powered. So they still have a reactor there that produces the power. But nuclear power and a nuclear weapon capability are very different stories. Nuclear power stations all over the world produce power generally very, very safely. Ships and submarines powered by nuclear reactors are generally pretty safe. However, conversely, a nuclear reaction to cause a nuclear explosion is obviously designed to be very destructive and very dangerous, but we don't want to conflate the two in this case. If it was the other way around and Britain and say the United States had suffered something like this, then I would say absolutely yes. I'd be really concerned. The nuclear deterrence is always all about equilibrium and balance. And the reason it's worked so well for the last 85 years is it's been in balance with equilibrium. When that balance is affected, then that is where you have a time for real concern. Now, one could suggest, and no doubt this is why the Russians are being so quiet, if they have lost some capability, that would create an imbalance. But I don't think the West, certainly not the UK, France, and the US, who are the Western NATO military capable nuclear countries, would want to exploit this in any way. Conversely, if it's the other way around, the Russians might. I mean, the other major players in this are the Chinese, the Indians, and the Pakistanis, and perhaps to a lesser extent, the Israelis. So the fact that Russia is in difficulty, I don't think will encourage anybody else to flex their nuclear capability, as it were. But if it was the other way around, yeah, one would be really concerned, because no doubt, particularly with Putin failing in Ukraine at the moment, if he could do anything to make the West pull out of support for Ukraine with the backdrop of a nuclear issue, he absolutely would. But in this case, I don't think so. And I think this is why we're hearing very little out of the Russians, because they don't want to give any indication at all that some of their capability might be unusable for a short or long term.